Hello, everyone. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Awesome. Welcome to the IRES Thursday seminar. We have two IRES students presenting today, Scott McKenzie and Nima Jamshidi. Both the speakers will have 20 minutes to present, followed by 10 minutes of question answer session. Scott will go first, followed by Nima. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge that UBC's Vancouver Point Grey campus is situated on the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Musqueam people. I would also like to acknowledge that you are joining us today from many places near and far and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. Now I'll request Leila to kindly introduce Scott. To you, Leila.
Great. Hi, everyone. So I'm pleased today to be introducing Scott McKenzie, who is a PhD candidate with us in IRES. His background in terms of his previous studies is in everything from American studies to environmental studies, and he has a Juris Doctorate in law. He's had a number of fellowships and other honors to his credit, and he has quite a bit of different work experience, from consulting with the World Bank to working with the International Water Resources Association to having served in the Peace Corps in Morocco. He also has quite a few different publications on all things water. So everything from looking at the African Great Lakes to the Columbia River Treaty to cooperation river. He's also been the last few years writing a lot of more op-ed sort of pieces on different topics. And today we'll hear more about his dissertation research focused on the human right to water. Thanks, Scott.
Hi, thanks. Let me try to get the screen sharing going here, and then we'll get going. Okay, how does that look? I'm hoping it looks good. All right. So the title of my dissertation is Advocates, Citizen Engagement with the Law to Address Water Governance in Cape Town and Accra. And I think, as I sort of try to give the background and to segue in from what Leila said, the background of this study is that, the background of the study is that Leila received a very nice research grant from the Canadian government, which we appreciate, focusing on these two different areas and looking at citizenship and questions around lived experiences of citizenship in these two areas. There's been a number of students that have come through the department with research in this area, each focusing master's and PhD students on different, some in both, some in more of one area or the other. And particularly, I think I'm indebted to all those students that came before me, not just because they wrote great papers and did that research and sort of laid some of the material out there to say, Scott, here's who's good to talk to. Here's maybe not who's good to talk to. But also just because they sort of helped kind of lead the way. So I'm particularly indebted to Lucy Ordina, who did some great work and finished her PhD maybe 2 years ago. She's really great. You can look her up. So particularly what I'm trying to address through the PhD is the links and the relationship between water, law, and space. I think, as Leila mentioned in the introduction there, most of my work is focused on the water and most of it on law. In the past, I have a Juris Doctorate, just a law degree from the United States. And I had written quite a lot of work earlier regarding the human right to water and a lot around transboundary issues as well. And I found my engagement personally with the law to be, I wouldn't go so far as to say boring, but I was looking for more intellectual engagement. And in particular, I found that in reading the laws, reading court judgments, kind of constructing the common legal studies article, which often kind of flows from looking for application of the law in new areas, which might guide the jurisprudence in that area later. There's a lot of different great things about that kind of study, but I found myself saying, Scott, I want to engage a little bit more with how is it being enacted on the ground? How are people, how is this affecting the laws that you're talking about, affecting people's real world? And more importantly, how are those real world experiences sort of affecting the law and how it's being enacted? So that's kind of the genesis for how intellectually this study came about. So the two questions that I'm looking to engage here, which were, and I'll discuss this a little bit more as well, but how do citizens who are involved in legal and extra-legal processes articulate rights and rights discourses to influence water governance and their own domestic water outcomes? And I think that particularly the domestic water outcomes is kind of important here because in both my cases, people are engaging very much with it in their local communities and a little bit less on the international advocacy side. I think that's just important to kind of point out. But then also to look at, how do specific rights-based and legal approaches fit within broader sets of strategies, legal processes, and mobilizations to improve, as defined by these citizens, water access and enhanced participatory governance. I think it's really important that they're to focus on this small side part that says defined by these citizens. One of the things that I think I took into, and I think that maybe we can also speak to this in our own studies and our own research as well, how easy it is to, when we go off into the field work, to take not exactly our own biases, but some of our own ideas into what we're studying. That's natural. I mean, that's going to happen with everybody. No one can go in as a blank slate. But I think it's important, when I was going in, I was taking some ideas about, what this is what you need, this is what you need to be expecting, why aren't they advocating for this? Why aren't they advocating for that? And then the more time I spent in the field, the more I kind of realized that the ways and the methods that people have come up with for advocacy it can vary, and that maybe there's something to be learned through the variety and the different processes that people are using, rather than trying to take a kind of one-size-fits-all approach. And I think that kind of goes back into the University of Law. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So just as a quick overview, we're trying to hopefully I was trying to make some contributions to the fields of geography and legal studies, and specifically to the emerging subfield of legal geography, which is pretty much what you think it is. It's kind of the merging of law and geography. We'll talk about it a little more. Law and geography, and trying to use that to kind of deepen the relationship and understanding between the ways that space and law co-create each other. It's a kind of an interesting way to consider and think about laws. There's a lot of good research coming out now recently, kind of applying these sort of concepts to everything from bathrooms and the ways that our regulations deal with those, and the ways those create our ideas about space and privacy, but as well as talking things about the ways that laws inform our knowledge of, for example, of zoos. So there's a lot of interesting work being done there. And I used Cape Town and Accra to draw on these interviews, and I interviewed both activists, and for me it was very important to also interview legal professionals, and then to combine that with a reading of local, state, or national laws, regulations, and court filings. I thought it was particularly interesting for me to study legal professionals as well. One of the things that I noticed, and I think that maybe some of you can speak to this in your own field experience as well, depends on where you're going and who you're talking to. But particularly in Cape Town, there's a fatigue. There's something of a tiredness of going to the same, not me, but not just UBC, but it's common to find PhD and researchers from the global north coming down to the global south and interviewing the same activists over and over. And these activists are getting not tired, but there is kind of an aspect here where you're saying, well, why are we keep talking to you? I had several people tell me, no, we don't want to talk to you. We've already talked to several researchers. And I say, I don't know who these guys are. Please help me. I'd like to learn from you. And they say, look, we've already helped 3 people this year. And I say, okay, well, maybe there's something else to be learned about. So for me, it was really interesting to be able to speak kind of as somebody with a law background and who has practiced as a lawyer, to speak to other practicing lawyers, to kind of get their perspective and get their understanding of what was happening. And I thought that brings sort of both a different perspective to the operation, but also some needed and needed way for me to be able to get access to people. And I think that maybe in ways that I hope that maybe it was a way that other people might not have had the same levels of access. And so I hope that maybe I was able to bring some unique research in that way. So legal geography, like I said, kind of forms the something of the theoretical and the literature backbone of the research that I've been doing. And legal geography has been said to have sort of an ontology, and that is to say, concepts about subject areas, and as well as epistemology, um, including its own methods, some people, and I think as I mentioned earlier, it's been described sort of as the study of space, law, and society, how they kind of come together and they're kind of co-created. And there's certain areas of investigation, and this is particularly, as I had said earlier about bathrooms or zoos, there has been in legal geography a bit of a focus on Anglophone areas and Anglophone legal regimes. And so I'm hoping that through my research, particularly, which although both countries are Anglophone, they're in the global South, and I'm hoping that I'll be able to bring in some work and research from these other, not from the United States, not from Europe, but from some legal traditions in these other areas that I hope I'm kind of broadening the legal geography field a little bit. But I think at its heart also, legal geography is sort of it's interdisciplinary. And so I had this quote here just to say that the braided lines of inquiry out of a confluence of various intellectual interests. It sounds so interdisciplinary to me. I think we're a department that focuses on that. We're a department that specializes in that. So I think all of us sort of have a certain understanding of what that means to us and what we can sort of bring through our interdisciplinary research and our interdisciplinary work. And how that can kind of create its own work in its own research areas, but how it can also be turned around and used to sort of, I think, strengthen the areas which we come from, to strengthen the geography or to strengthen legal studies. And that's kind of what I'm trying to do here. Talk about ways that human geography is not really focused as much on legal studies. I know that some people would contest that, but I think that it can be said that it hasn't focused sometimes as much on some of the legal parts of legal studies. For example, in human geography, there's a good focus on things around human right to water, for example. But I noticed that in doing the research and literature review that so much does focus on the lived experience and how it kind of really affects people, but didn't engage as deeply with what I felt and wanted to see more of was an engagement with the actual laws, engaging with legal judgments instead of just purely interviews, which are extremely important to get that kind of qualitative research, but also to kind of look at court judgments and to look at cases and see how they're kind of playing out. As well, I think, I'm hoping to kind of address some of the anti-geographical tendencies. Legal scholarship can be completely devoid at times, although it's improving, I think. But if you're reading some, can give you the sense that it really exists only in the law and exists not really in space, in place. And another issue is hopefully kind of trying to bring forward some idea, notion about methods. I think, all of us are working on methods, whether, we're a first-year student or now me, something much more than a first-year student. But, we're all looking at kind of how we're doing our research, what ways will we use, what tools will we draw out to sort of get to our point. So let me try to get to my own point. I myself used qualitative and lots of semi-structured interviews. You can tell I'm not really a particularly structured person myself. And so, I found the conversations that sort of were able to kind of take their own train while having some certain questions already written down and focusing. I thought that was quite helpful, as well as using observation. Spent a lot of time just walking and observing and seeing and talking to people. I thought it was really helpful in sort of strengthening my own research. But what the important part was for me to kind of look and see how people are living and how they're imagining the space and the place, and particularly how they're imagining laws and their inaction for them. So to understand about how people are understanding what does the human right to water mean to them. It can mean different things to different people. It turns out that it hasn't all been written down already, but that all around the world, everyone has different ideas about what that means. So And my hope was that this could also, like I say, just not to go on here because I think I need to get to the actual meat of the bones, but oh, thanks, Layla. Okay, so we're gonna get to that. Okay, so we did 3 pieces out of this. I'm just doing this PhD in a traditional 3-article kind of way with an introduction and conclusion at the end. So there's 3 pieces. The first one's the human right to water. We're looking at how South African citizens can make and expand the human right to water in their own communities. The second area is looking at legal geography and citizenship, particularly with environmental lawyers in South Africa. And the third one is looking at different notions of justice in Cape Town and Accra. So looking at the human right to water. This is a case study set in South Africa, set in Cape Town, South Africa. And what it looks at is the extremely slow impact of the human right to water on certain communities and their now quite rational frustration, quite strong fatigue with the existence of constitutionally mandated rights compared with their rather lackluster realization. So in the case, this is a legal case that comes out of the informal settlements of South Africa, where essentially the residents are taking the city to court, suggesting that their rights, their human rights, have been violated because they do not have flush toilets in their communities. That the city has been providing them for an excessive period of time, upwards of decades now, with portable porta potties, like at a concert, as their sanitation option. Which, and just like it, anyone who's used a porta potty knows, they become full, they become dirty, they fall over, they are dangerous. They're not places you want to go to at night. There's lots of problems. And what's interesting is that the human right to water has a realization both at the international level as well as in the South African Constitution. At the international level, we can trace the human right to water back millennia. There's often been laws resulting requiring that people, all citizens, have some access to water, because we recognize that water has a unique central component in human life. And even more recently, in the 70s, 1977, through conferences, human right to water became a major issue at the international level. More recently, the United Nations was able to recognize that through a resolution. But we all know that United Nations resolutions don't necessarily have the force of law, unfortunately. So we have to look to other sources of law in addition. And the United Nations resolutions or guidelines that are issued by different committees can shape, they can create an idea around what does that provide us, what does that give us as a human right to water, but they may not necessarily be dispositive. For example, you may not be able to go to court and say, the United Nations says this, so now you need to provide this. In this case, what I found was, in talking to people, we're going to go back, in talking to people who were involved with the court case, as well as by digging into the court case itself and seeing what was filed and how they were articulating their ideas around rights, I found an interesting aspect, which was that a couple of interesting things I found. One of the things is that within the human right to water, within the scholarship and the academic community, there's something of a discussion about the nature of sanitation. And the idea is that maybe people have a unique and differentiated right to sanitation, which is not part of water. You can imagine there's different notions around how to use different types of toilets. Some toilets are dry, for example. There's different ideas about what water should be used for. Some water can be used for drinking. Some water could be used for things around the house. But that at the end, maybe these should be delinked. And this is kind of an ongoing process. But what I found by talking to people at these activists who are involved with the court case filing, they were not delinking the two. They were bringing the two very closely together. And in fact, although the human right to water exists in the South African Constitution, very clearly stating, as well as a number of other human rights, people on the ground were often not exactly conflating the rights, which a lawyer might find rather concerning, but that they were really bringing them all together. And they were saying, we have the right to sanitation, we have the right to water, we have the right to housing, and all of these are part of, for them, a broader, more holistic way to approach what the government owes them, which is they owe them the right to housing, water, sanitation, all together as a package, not as indiscrete separate things. I also found that a lot of people were able to use the human right to water as a way to discuss other intangible rights like dignity and privacy. I mean, I think a lot of us are maybe familiar with the ideas around the penumbra of privacy, I believe is they would describe it in the United States jurisprudence. But they're very difficult to describe. How do we describe our human right to dignity? How do we describe our right to privacy? And so I think what I found was that many people were using the human right to water as a way to push forward their right to dignity, to be able to have a real toilet in their own home. So now in the next article, citizenship, and Bonnie, you should try to, I really can't see my screen, so you should just kind of break in if I need to stop. But the next article here discusses the ways about citizenship and the ways that certain lawyers in South Africa are having their citizenship altered, having it influenced in their notions about lived citizenship. Here is a situation where these environmental lawyers who are not exactly pro bono, but they're working with impacted communities, and particularly with communities who have had their these are lawyers in Cape Town, and they're working with communities all over South Africa, and particularly ones who have been impacted by mining activities in their community. Now, these lawyers, who are strong advocates themselves, had gone out and they'd gone to a public forum. They were at the University of Cape Town, giving a small lecture, which is probably something that all of us can kind of relate to.
Scott, I would suggest you wrap up, please.
Oh, okay, cool. Sorry. Shoot, I'm sorry. Okay, so quickly to say, they went to a small public lecture, which all of us can relate to, and they spoke about their case. They were taken to court because the mining company said that they were disparaging them. And so these lawyers found themselves not prosecuting, but being prosecuted, rather on the opposite side of things. Now, what's important, I think, for me to understand is that, being able to do your job and able to speak in the public forum, a right that all of us seem to pretty much have, and we're all kind of executing right now, is a way of enacting citizenship and being able to express ourselves fully, which is a basic human right. But these lawyers are having this impacted. And what's also important, I thought, what I discovered, was that through the work that these lawyers are doing, their work in helping other communities helps those communities to express their citizenship. But by having the lawyers in one entirely separate area, part of the country, speaking and having themselves restricted, that had impacts on those citizens elsewhere. So, and finally, the last article is going to discuss, and I'm going to try to wrap this up here because I know you're kind of anxious for me to finish, and I don't want to take time from our other questions or from my other speakers. But it's just to understand the ways that justice can be framed in different ways. When I went to Accra, one of the things that I was really remarked about, having just come from South Africa, because I did the 2 fieldwork site visits back to back, I was actually struck with the fact that in Accra, people were not advocating nearly as ferociously, and particularly not through the court system, as I expected. I was a little surprised and frankly a little bit disappointed because the whole point of my research was to be looking at court cases and legal filings, and so it came a little bit more tricky than I expected. But what I started to realize was that people don't have to go to the courts to articulate human rights, and you don't have to be articulating something in a human rights context to see that people are dealing with justice issues around water. And so particularly many of the people I was discussing, for example, having just come from a sanitation case, as I was discussing earlier, people were not advocating for human right to sanitation, although there is advocacy in Accra around a human right to water, and that's important to mention. But these people were actually taking things into their own hands, and they were helping people to save just a little bit. They would say, just save just a few pennies a day, and soon you'll have a toilet, enough money to buy a toilet. They are providing toilets. And now I admit that for me, in some ways, I just challenged with that because admittedly, the government should be stepping into these communities and should be helping. But at the same time, I thought it was very interesting to look at the ways justice is being defined differently. So,
Scott, I think we should move to the questions, otherwise there won't be a chance.
Go for it.
So keep your lesson slide up, and then we'll go.
Okay.
But let's turn on your video as well, so people can.
Okay.
And
Sorry.
let's see if we have one or two student questions. So you could raise your hand, or you could just go ahead and unmute.
I didn't see your second message. Sorry, Layla.
Who would like to start us off with a question in the couple remaining minutes that we have?
I'll go. Sorry, I'm on my phone. I'm not sure if you can see me or if my video is on here, but my Zoom is not working on my computer. I suspect some other people might have been having issues with their Zoom. But I was just sort of wondering, Scott, thanks for the presentation, but why you think it is that there were these drastic differences between Accra and Cape Town, and what that might say about institutions or the ways that people believe that advocacy can be successful between those two places. What that might say about their political history or their colonial history, or the various ways that people do go about advocating for right to water being so disparate in those two places.
Yeah, good question. I think that a lot of it has to come down to, like you said, unique histories, unique understandings about the law and the relationship and the role of law in these countries. And I mean, the South African example is well studied and well understood. Not well understood and well studied, but it has been studied. But it's well known that South Africa went through a brutal history of apartheid, and it was sort of but through articulating questions and ideas around human rights, that some of that history was history was changed. And I think that, through this sort of actions, people really became to understand the role of human rights and to grasp onto this idea of the human rights. It's why they're so prominent in the Constitution there. Whereas Accra and Ghana just doesn't have the same kind of history. They don't have a history of it articulated in that same way. And so there, I think that, people have they're much more used to a court system that doesn't really work for them, through a set of laws and rights that are, while not, I would not say that they are bad, but they're just not as robust, and particularly not as around human rights, as you might find in South Africa. In South Africa, they have a whole day, Human Rights Day. But in Accra, they don't celebrate this day. So
let's see if we can get one more student question.
There was a question in the chat box.
Okay.
It's from the similarities between Indigenous access to water in Canada. That wasn't mine. I was just reading it.
Looks like Denali asked, do you see any similarities in terms of how these issues play out with respect to Indigenous communities in Canada?
Interesting question. Great question. First, to say, I wouldn't claim to have as much background or studies with Indigenous water access in Canada, but I do know that a lot of people in our department have studied it very well, and so I would also discuss with them and defer to any of them for their better input, including Layla. I would say that, and I think first, to front that these issues poor water access, either to say by quantity or quality, or by, I mean, you know, there might not be enough water, the water might be polluted, or in otherwise unpalatable or uninteresting or bad taste, whatever. Or it might be economically unavailable. You know, water, even if at the, you know, if it's bottled water and it's too expensive, then it might as well not be water at all. You know, it's the same impact. And it has myriad impacts on people's public health, on people's individuals' health, which kind of have span out into the whole community. But I think that, you know, one thing that you can see is that, you know, particularly in the last few, maybe just to kind of draw a quick conclusion, is that I think that, you know, in Canada, also a country with a good, strong, robust legal system, and you've seen in the last 20 years or more, an increasingly strong advocacy through of Indigenous people through the legal system, slowly building up a series of positive judgments in their favor, granting more and more rights. And so I think that what you maybe we're seeing here is a situation where, you know, maybe first of all, Indigenous people in Canada are engaging with the legal systems in the same way that South Africans might be engaging with their legal system, as opposed to ways that Ghanaians might be engaging with their legal system, which is to say that they're turning to it as a source of their rights, as a way
Well,
to.
Scott, we have to close and turn to the next speaker. So thanks very much. Take care.
Thank you.
I have to go. So we'll turn to Hadi to introduce our next speaker. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yep.
It gives me great pleasure to introduce Nima Jamshidi. Nima comes to us from, after having completed a bachelor's degree in civil engineering at Tehran University. Tehran University is a little bit like Harvard of Iran. And and Nima's work has been one that started long before he arrived here. Some of you remember Michiko Namazu and Rainer Lempert. We piggybacked a web crawler onto the signals that Car2Go and Evo were sending out about the location of their available cars, and collected that data for almost 2 years. And Nima has been wrangling all of that data in order to garner insights about actual use of car share vehicles, answering some really critical questions. So without further ado, I'll call on Nima to share his findings.
Let me start sharing. Do you see the slide?
Yep, you're fine.
Okay. Thank you, Hadi, for your kind introduction. And thank you, Kushang, for the land acknowledgement in the beginning of the session. Good afternoon, everyone. Since I'm a slow talker, I will jump right into the presentation so that helpfully all the slides would be covered in the next 20 minutes. There are 3 questions that in this presentation I will try to provide some related information or perhaps answers for. Number 1 is about the number of private vehicles that the car sharing vehicle can displace. The second question is spatio-temporally, how are car sharing vehicles used? And the last question is one-way car sharing is one-way car sharing a complement to or substitute for rapid transit? We use the open API of Car2Go and Evo to collect the data. We had address, longitude, and latitude, and fuel level of every available vehicle at 5-minute intervals. We can see the location and the time a vehicle goes off the radar and comes back on the radar with an accuracy limit of 5 minutes. We consider this going off and coming back a trip in our analysis. While a car is in use, we don't have any information about the vehicle nor the user. We have data from EVO for a longer period of time, approximately 7 months longer. The graph on top shows that during the period under study, EVO fleet expanded while Car2Go shrunk. Sorry. The lower graph shows that on average, there is about 6,000, there are about 6,000 trips per day for each of the car sharing services. As we can see from the graphs, we had to clean the data and filter out some of the anomalies before continuing. In total, there are 3.4 million trips for EVO and 2 million trips for Car2Go in the data. We use the period of vehicle not being available as a measure of trip duration. There is a peak around 20 to 35 minutes of duration. We also observed that EVO has a slightly higher number of trips, over 60 minutes. But these durations include the reservation grace period, which could be as long as 30 minutes. We don't really know whether the doors were unlocked and the trip started right away or right at the end of the 30 minutes of booking period. We think that more trips start around the middle of this period, but we don't have any information about it. So we need to take that into account, which is why the average trip duration includes the reservation period. This is important because it means that this 56 and 58 minutes are not the average revenue minutes. Being a sustainable transportation mode, this value is critical to the economics of car sharing systems. Here we have the average trips per vehicle per day for weekdays and holidays. There isn't much of a difference between weekdays and holidays in terms of number of usage per car per day. On average, Car2Go cars are used about half a trip more than EVO vehicles. The reason that Car2Go has a bimodal distribution here is because of the decrease in their fleet size over the time. In the meanwhile, EVO maintained the number of trips per day around 5.9 by increasing their fleet size in order to answer the growing demand for the car sharing service and perhaps absorbing part of the user demand from their shrunk rival. So this is the summary of the trick data we had. Two important concerns about car sharing systems is around its interaction with public transit and the appeal it creates among the young users for driving and using vehicles and eventually buying a vehicle. One of the intentions behind big automakers' decision to include the vehicles in car sharing services is for promoting their product. They are hopeful that the impression their product makes on the first-time users would help them in selling their product later on. For example, we know that Mercedes-Benz, Daimler, the owner of Mercedes-Benz, was the owner of Car2Go company, and they introduced two models of their products in that fleet for the promotion. For this part of study, instead of looking at the trips, we focus on the time in between each two trips, that, on the time in between of each of the two trips that the car was parked somewhere in the service area. We divided the region into 75 neighborhoods and ended up with 58 neighborhoods with sufficient data for further analysis. We use K-mean clustering analysis on vehicle location and availability data to extract the characteristics of different neighborhoods served by Carsharing. So these are two examples of the input for our K-mean clustering. Here we can see the availability of cars in downtown East Side and Dunbar Southlands neighborhoods by the hour of a day of the week. We separated holiday Mondays from regular Mondays and put the former as another column in the analysis because we assumed that at least in some of the neighborhoods, there would be different patterns for the holiday Monday and a regular Monday. Comparing the pattern in downtown East Side and Dunbar, the coloring tells you where the cars are available or scarce. In the redder the color of a block is, the higher the number of vehicles parked in the neighborhood is in that hour. The opposite is true for the blue color. Relatively fewer cars are available when the color is blue. Here we can see distinct patterns between these two neighborhoods. You can see the correspondence in time and space between Dunbar not having lots of cars and downtown East Side having a lot in different hours. For example, on weekdays, downtown East Side is more crowded in the midday, while more cars are parked in Dunbar during midnight. So these patterns characterize each neighborhood, and here we have the result of the clustering analysis. We have 4 main types of neighborhoods with different hourly patterns identified. The top left cluster includes neighborhoods such as Arbutus Ridge, Shaughnessy, Kitsilano, or Dunbar. Based on the pattern, we labeled these neighborhoods residential because the users on aggregate move the car sharing cars from these neighborhoods in the morning and bring them back in the afternoon. The other 3 clusters all have a similar pattern in weekdays. On weekdays, they all act as working neighborhoods on weekdays while having different patterns during weekends and holidays. The next cluster includes neighborhoods such as downtown Vancouver or downtown East Side. We see red color in the evening of Friday and Saturday. We concluded that these are the entertainment destinations at weekend nights. Therefore, we called this group office and entertainment. The bottom right cluster includes neighborhoods such as UBC main campus, Grouse Mountain, and YVR Airport Station. Their weekend patterns continue to be the same as the weekday patterns. Therefore, we call these day destination neighborhoods. The last cluster has the smallest group of neighborhoods. One example from this cluster is Burnaby Mountain, where SFU's main campus is located. The pattern in the weekends and holidays is similar to the one in the residential neighborhoods. We assume that car sharing mostly serves the residents on campus during the weekends, and there is less of working activity in the weekends. And here we have the neighborhoods drawn on the map and colored by their type. Most of the neighborhoods, as we can see, are residential. Office and entertainment neighborhoods are concentrated around downtown, and the other 2 types of neighborhoods are spread around the city. Now we will look into the car sharing usage and its interaction with public transit. We considered the 3 SkyTrain lines and 99 bus line as the rapid transit lines for our study. These are the lines with frequent service throughout the day that one can assume reliable for including them in their travel choices. Travel mode choices. In this graph, We have the neighborhood to neighborhood trips. The color in each box represents the number of trips per day between an origin and a destination. The origins are on the x-axis and the destinations on the y-axis. All origin and destinations served by a direct rapid transit service are marked with a red boundary around the cell. As you would expect, the places with the greatest density of population and rapid transit access are where the most of the trips are. So in this service area, 59% of the population are in these origin and destinations. It has 63% of the rapid transit routes and accounts for 75% of all the car sharing trips. This is important because municipality and governments see car sharing as a service that can help residents with their mobility needs, especially the ones who have less access to public transit, while here we observe that most of the car sharing trips are between neighborhoods with better access to public transit in comparison to other neighborhoods. So we want to go deeper in details for the analysis of EVO trips near rapid transit stations. We want to see how often car sharing users would use the cars on the same route that these lines serve. We draw circles of 600 circles with 600 meters of radius around the rapid transit stations and count the trips that start and end in the in these circles. Why 600 meters? Because TransLink suggested that the suitable walking distance to 99B line stations is 600 meters. It has also noted that for SkyTrans, it's 800 meters. We stuck to 600 meters for all the rapid transit stations as a conservative measure. We also want to check, we also want to check if users would take the car to reach to a rapid transit station and continue their trip by riding on the rapid transit, or would use the car after riding on rapid transit as a part of their trip. We call the former a first leg trip. We call the former first leg trip and the latter last leg. For calculating these trips, we look into the trips that end or start within 200 meters of rapid transit stations. Also, for each neighborhood, we assign the 3 closest stations from each line as the stations suitable for a first or last leg trip, because we don't want to consider a trip that, for example, starts in Dunbar and ends at Commercial Drive station on 99B line. We don't want to consider it a first leg trip. Therefore, we limit the stations for each neighborhood to the closest ones. Here we have the trips in the morning commute hours that are originated from a residential neighborhood and ended in a working neighborhood during morning commute hours. The residential neighborhoods are from the first cluster identified in the clustering analysis. The working neighborhoods are from the other 3 clusters. Now in these graphs, instead of only neighborhoods, we also have rapid transit stations as the location of origin or destination of trips. And here we have this vertical red box shows the trips that originated around the stations and ended in a working neighborhood. These are last leg in the morning commute, and these are the first leg in the morning commute. more trips start in, for example, for Mount Pleasant, start in Mount Pleasant and end in downtown, in comparison to the trips that start in Mount Pleasant and end in Expo Line stations. And we see a high frequency between B99 stops. These are the trips that substitute the rapid transit service. And here is the result for the afternoon commute. Again, we have the first leg and last leg trips, and we see a high frequency as a last leg trip from Expo Line to Kitsilano and West End. And for the summary, what we have found is that according to TransLink Trip to IRES survey, a private vehicle is used 1.6 times per day per person in Metro Vancouver. Car sharing vehicles, by our findings, are used 6 to 7 times per day. Therefore, a shared car is unlikely to be a substitute for 9 to 11 vehicles in a regular use, as reported in the surveys. Also, 75% of all car sharing trips serve around 60% of the population. That already is served by more than 60% of rapid transit routes. And the last one is that 15% of car sharing trips in total complement rapid transit by complementing, first or last leg trip, whereas 10% substitute for them. Among commuting trips, these fractions are 26% and 4% respectively. This is important for the policymakers to see how car sharing services are used during the day and in the region for their future decisions. I need to thank Michigo Namazu for initiating the data gathering, Rainer Lampert for data cleanup and initiating me in big data analysis, and also a big thanks for Hadi for his help and his insights and his supervision. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Nima. So questions, please. I suggest you put questions in the chat box and I will call on you. Thanks, Ramsey. Any questions, please? Okay, so Joanne, do you want to ask your question?
Hi, yeah, thank you. That was a wonderful presentation. It was very, very enlightening and interesting. I was wondering if you were surprised at all by any of the results of, like, say, where they started and stopped or where they didn't start and stop.
Well, yeah, the high number for the substitutes was interesting. And also it was interesting that, for me, it was interesting that 75% of the trips were concentrated in that small box.
Excellent. Were you expecting like more of a use like away from the B line or like say in Mount Pleasant itself? Like, was that surprising at all?
Yeah, so we hoped that there would be higher percentage for the first and last leg and lower percentage for substitute. But yeah, this is the result. and it was interesting that the
Okay, Nima, you've got
yeah,
to be quick in answering
sorry.
because we don't have too much time. David
Yeah.
Boyd asks, what would you say to policymakers based on these results?
Yeah, so it's important because policymakers look at car sharing as a service that uh, could help the rapid transit with some of its caveats. Based on these studies, at first, this shows that if we have data, we can study the service very well using the empirical data instead of surveys, and also uh, also it's important for the further policies. For example, we can put some policies in place so that we could encourage users for the first or last leg trips, or discourage them to substitute the rapid transit routes. Yeah. We also, I didn't include it in the presentation, but we also looked into the bookings that were lapsed. We were able to extract the bookings that were canceled from the data, and based on that, we were able to understand the booking behavior of the users, and that would also help for further policies that are presented by the companies, so that there would be more fairness in the usage of the car sharing service.
Yeah, you just answered Rudri's question, which was about availability of vehicles. So you found what, something like 30% of all bookings never go anywhere?
Yeah, it's a percentage around that. 30% of all the bookings were going to be canceled, and during that booking period, the car would be unavailable to the other users. So that would create some problems in neighborhoods and places that there are scarce. The car sharing is scarce. Yeah.
Okay, so we just have one last minute for the last question, if there is one. And if there isn't, I'm going to push you a little bit more. So for example, did the city give car sharing special privileges because they thought lots of cars were going to be displaced and
Yeah,
ownership was
exactly.
going to? So what kind of, I mean, if indeed 11 cars are displaced by every car sharing car, what are you actually displacing in not having those cars?
Yeah, so based on what we found, we see that it's not gonna displace 9 to 11 cars that are regularly used by people. And so these cars would be shed by the owners that less frequently use their vehicles. Therefore, car sharing would be a uh, good option if you want to decrease the on-street parkings, because people leave their cars on the street and would infrequently use them. But it would be less important for reducing the traffic or reducing GHG emissions in the city by promoting car sharing.
Well, thank you very much, Nima. That was a great presentation and we're keeping to time. Thanks everyone for being in our audience and asking great questions.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nima. Great data set.
Thank you, Nima.
Thanks, Nima and Scott. This was wonderful.
Stop share.